There is a very specific, heavy kind of silence that falls over deep woods when something dangerous is moving through them. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping forest, but the kind of suffocating stillness that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up because the crickets have stopped chirping and the wind seems to be holding its breath. I have lived in Blackwood Valley for over 30 years, long enough to know the difference between a coyote stepping on a dry branch and the rhythmic, heavy crunch of a boot that has no business being on my soil. It was 12:03 a.m. on a Tuesday when the world shifted, the moment three armed men decided that the invisible legal line separating my property from the Pineview Heights subdivision was just a suggestion. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have known in their arrogance, was that I wasn't just watching them, I was waiting for them, and I had turned my entire property into a stage for their destruction. The sound that woke me wasn't an Apo's TA scream. It was the low, sputtering cough of an ATV engine, moving slow, creeping with the lights off, the kind of stealth that screams and quote, predator, end quote. I didn't end Apos. T turn on my bedroom lamps. Didn't end Apos. T panic. Just slid out of bed and pulled on my canvas jacket. Stepping out onto the porch where the darkness was so thick you could almost taste the pine and the coming rain. My eyes adjusted, scanning the tree line of Thorns Run, the creek that feeds my vineyard, and there it was, the jagged, harsh beam of a tactical flashlight cutting through the fog like a knife. They came out of the tree lean like they owned the place, three silhouettes dressed in what I can only describe as in quote, eBay special ops and quote, gear, cheap tactical vests, helmets that still looked shiny, and radios hissing loud enough to wake the dead. I've worked with real operators, men who treat silence like a religion, but these guys, these clowns from Titan Perimeter Solutions, were loud, clumsy, and reeking of unearned authority. I moved along my fence line, sticking to the shadows of the old oak trees, until I was standing right at the edge of the light, just as the leader, a towering wall of meat we'll call Kincaid, stepped onto my grass. He saw me, and instead of backing off, he smirked, a nasty expression illuminated by the glow of his flashlight, and said, and quote, evening, landlord, and quote, stretching the word out like a threat. I stared at the metal stake they had illegally driven into the ground on my side of the creek, and said nothing, just let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. Kincaid tapped the holster on his hip, a slow, deliberate and Apos, thud and Apos, that echoed in the night, and pointed a finger at my chest, saying, and quote, you're one signature away from being bulldozed, old man, and one bullet away from being a memory, end quote. He didn't end Apos. Tino, the microphone taped inside my jacket collar, caught every syllable. Didn't end Apos. Tino, he just handed me the keys to his own jail cell, but I just looked him in the eye and said, and quote, that's helpful, Sheriff Brody is going to love that recording, end quote. They laughed, actually laughed, because when you're a hired thug for a wealthy HOA, you think the law is something you buy, not something you obey. To understand why three paramilitary wannabes were trespassing on my land at midnight, you have to understand the water. The morning after the intrusion, I went to the county clerk's office, a place that smells like old coffee and dust, and showed the forged in quote, realignment notice in quote, I'd found on my door to the clerk, Mrs. Gable. She took one look at it, adjusted her bifocals, and snorted, and quote, this is as fake as a $3 bill, Elias, end quote. She pulled up the digital records, and the blood drained from my face, not from fear, but from cold, hard rage. Pineview Heights, led by their tyrannical board president Patricia Vane, had filed a request for and quote, riparian safety expansion, end quote, which is fancy lawyer talk for end quote, we want to steal your creek, end quote. The plans were right there on the screen, glossy and colorful, showing a massive artificial recreational lake for their residents, a lake that would be fed by damming up Thorns Run, drying out my vineyard, and killing the ecosystem I had spent 3 decades protecting. This wasn't about safety, it was about property values. It was about Patricia Vane wanting to add a zero to the price of every condo in her kingdom by stealing the water that kept my valley alive. I walked out of that county building into the gray morning light realizing that this wasn't an Apos, TA dispute, it was an invasion. Patricia and her end quote, security team end quote, at Titan thought I was just some old recluse who would roll over if they flashed enough guns and forged enough papers. They thought they were the hunters. I spent the drive home planning, my mind racing through inventory, lights, sensors, cameras, wiring. When I got back to the farmhouse, the air felt different, charged with kinetic energy, and I sat at my kitchen table staring at the forged document, letting the anger crystallize into focus. But the real twist, the thing that changed the game, happened at dusk. I was in the workshop when I heard footsteps, frantic, stumbling, gasping footsteps coming up my driveway. I stepped out, expecting Kincaid coming back to finish the job, but instead, a skinny, terrified young man practically collapsed onto my porch stairs. It was Arthur, the junior accountant for the HOA, a kid who looked like he hadn't and Oppos. He slept in a week and was currently vibrating with adrenaline. End quote. Elias, end quote. He choked out, looking over his shoulder at the dark road. End quote. We need to talk. They're planning something worse. They're going to force the issue tonight. End quote. I didn't end Oppos. Invite him in. Not yet. Just crossed my arms and watched him sweat. End quote. Patricia ISN and Oppos. Stopping. End quote. Arthur whispered, pulling a crumpled stack of papers from his jacket. End quote. She's using Titan to provoke you. She wants you to attack them. She wants a violent incident so she can get an emergency court order to seize the land under and Oppos. Public safety and Oppos. Laws. End quote. He handed me the papers, his hands shaking so hard the pages rattled. It was a digital login for a cloud drive. End quote. This is the real ledger. End quote. He said, his voice cracking. End quote. Double billings, bribes, money funneling to Kincaid's brother. It's all there. I'm not going to prison for her lake house. Elias. I'm just not. End quote. Arthur looked at me with the eyes of a man who had just jumped off a cliff and was praying for a parachute. End quote. They're coming back tonight. End quote. He said. End quote. And they aren't in Oppos. Coming to talk. End quote. I took the paper, tucked it into my pocket, and looked out at the darkening valley. End quote. Arthur, end quote. I said softly, end quote. Go home. Lock your door. You were never here. End quote. He vanished into the night, leaving me with the smoking gun evidence and the knowledge that a hit squad was en route. I walked into my barn, the smell of diesel and sawdust filling my lungs, and started pulling gear off the shelves. I didn't need Oppos. Need a gun to stop them. I needed physics, I needed electricity, and I needed to turn their own arrogance into a weapon. The sun dipped below the ridge, turning the sky a bruised purple, and I began to work with the steady, methodical pace of a man building a coffin for his enemies. I wasn't in Oppos, setting bear traps or digging pits. Nothing that Patricia Vane's expensive lawyers could twist into, end quote, booby traps, end quote. In a courtroom, no, I was using standard industrial equipment, just aggressively applied. I hauled 2 massive halogen construction towers out to the creek bed, the kind used to light up highway projects at midnight, and buried the cabling under the soft loam of the bank. I angled them up, hiding the fixtures behind the brush so they were invisible from the approach but pointed directly at eye level for anyone crossing the line. Then came the strobe, a wildfire-grade emergency beacon I'd bought for search and rescue, mounted high on the barn roof, focused like a laser on the crossing point. By 2 a.m., the valley was a black void, the moon hidden behind thick storm clouds, perfect conditions for men who like to hide in the dark. I sat on my porch in the pitch black, a mug of cold coffee in my hand, watching the monitors of the hardwired camera system I had installed hours ago. No Wi-Fi to jam, no cloud to hack, just raw 4K footage recording to a hardened drive in my basement. Then, the ground trembled. 3 distinct sets of footsteps, heavy and clumsy, crunching over the dry leaves. They were taking the exact same route as the night before, because tactical cosplayers like Kincaid are creatures of habit, lazy and overconfident. On the screen, I saw their flashlights bobbing, weaving through the trees. End quote. Spread out, end quote. Kincaid's voice hissed over the crisp audio feed. End quote. Keep eyes on the house. If the old man steps out, blind him, end quote. End quote. It and Oppos. S dark as hell out here, boss, end quote. One of the lackeys whined. End quote. Good, end quote. Kincaid grunted. End quote. Means he's asleep. End quote. I watched them reach the boundary, the real legal line, not the fake one they tried to sell me. Kincaid paused, looked at the house, and then, with a sneer that I could practically feel through the monitor, he stepped over. 1 step. 2 steps. Felony trespassing. I waited until they were fully committed, standing in the open kill zone of my trap, and then I whispered, and quote, smile for the camera, and quote, and hit the master switch. Click. The valley didn't end Opos. T just light up. It exploded into a supernova of white-hot brilliance. The halogens erupted from the ground like a nuclear flash, blasting 40,000 lumens straight up into their dilated pupils. At the same exact second, the roof strobe began to pulse, a disorienting, rapid-fire hammer of light that destroys depth perception and induces instant nausea. Kincaid screamed, a high-pitched sound that was entirely undignified, throwing his hands up as if he were physically being struck. The other 2 goons hit the dirt, scrambling, blinded, convinced they were under attack. I stepped out onto the porch, backlit by the ambient glow, calm as a Sunday morning. End quote. Kincaid. End quote. I shouted, my voice booming over the chaos. End quote. You are trespassing on recorded land. Smile, you're on the 4K live stream. End quote. Kincaid spun around, clawing at his eyes, disoriented, panic overriding his training. He reached for his hip. End quote. I'll put you down. End quote. He roared, pulling his weapon. End quote. Do it. End quote. I yelled back. End quote. Draw on an unarmed homeowner while standing on his land under video surveillance. See how that plays in court. End quote. He froze. The realization hit him harder than the light. He was exposed. There were no shadows to hide in. The other 2 mercenaries were already backing away, hands up, realizing the paycheck wasn't and Opos. T worth the felony charge. End quote. We need to go, boss. End quote. One of them yelled. End quote. This is a setup. End quote. End quote. It's not a setup. End quote. I called out, walking down the steps. End quote. It's a crime scene. End quote. And that's when the second sound cut through the night, sweeter than any choir. Sirens. Not the wail of an ambulance, but the aggressive, approaching growl of a sheriff's interceptor pushing 80 on a dirt road. Sheriff Brody didn't end Opos. T come alone. 2 cruisers skidded to a halt at the edge of the property, their red and blue lights mixing with my white halogens to create a surreal disco of justice. Brody stepped out, his hand resting on his service weapon, looking like a man who was absolutely done with Pineview Heights nonsense. End quote. Drop the belt, Kincaid. End quote. Brody barked. End quote. On your knees now. End quote. The raid was swift. The goons surrendered immediately. Kincaid, stripped of his darkness and his weapons, looked small, a bully realizing the playground just got closed. But the night wasn't Opos. T over. As Brody was cuffing Kincaid, a sleek black Mercedes tore up the road and screeched to a halt. Out stepped Patricia Vane, wearing a trench coat over her pajamas, screaming before she even slammed the door. End quote. What is the meaning of this? These men are authorized security. End quote. She shrieked, storming toward us. Sheriff Brody stood up, dusted off his knees, and looked at her with a calm loathing. End quote. Mrs. Vane, you're just in time. End quote. End quote. I demand you release my employees. End quote. She yelled, pointing a manicured finger at me. End quote. That man is a threat to community safety. End quote. End quote. Actually, end quote. I said, stepping forward and pulling out the tablet Arthur had given me. End quote. I think the threat is the person who texted and Opos. Cross the line, force a reaction and Opos. At 2:11 a.m. End quote. I held the screen up. Patricia froze. Her face went gray. End quote. And end quote. Brody added, end quote. We have the sworn statement from your accountant, Arthur, regarding the embezzlement. End quote. Patricia turned to run, actually tried to pivot back to her car, but a second deputy was already there, blocking the door. The click of handcuffs on Patricia Vane was the quietest sound of the night, but it echoed the loudest. End quote. We are in Opos. T done. End quote. Brody said to me as they shoved a sobbing Patricia into the back of a cruiser. End quote. We have a warrant for Kincaid's house based on the intel you gave us. You want to see what your neighbors were really up to? End quote. I hopped in the truck and followed the convoy. We kicked in the door of Kincaid's rental house an hour later. What we found in his garage turned the blood in my veins to ice. It wasn't Opos. T just a security office. It was a war room. Maps of the valley covered the walls, with red circles around my house, the vineyard, and other holdout properties. But under the workbench, inside a plastic tote, was the real horror. Zip ties, duct tape, chloroform, a mesmerizingly illegal collection of modified firearms with the serial numbers filed off. End quote. Kidnapping kit, end quote. One of the deputies whispered, horrified. Sheriff Brody picked up a map where my house was marked with the word target. End quote. They weren't and Oppos. T just going to sue you, Elias, end quote. He said softly. End quote. They were going to make you disappear, end quote. The courtroom, 3 months later, smelled like floor wax and anxiety. The silence here was different than the woods. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of judgment. The entire town of Blackwood Valley had packed the gallery, standing room only, because everyone wanted to see the fall of the empire. Patricia Vane sat at the defense table, her hair perfectly coiffed, but her eyes darting around like a trapped animal. Kincaid sat separately, wearing a cheap suit that strained at the shoulders, looking at the floor. He knew what was coming. The prosecutor didn't and Oppos. T need to be theatrical. The evidence did the screaming for him. They played the video from my porch, the blinding light, the terror, the threat of murder. Then came the digital evidence Arthur had provided. The texts, the wire transfers, the blueprints for the illegal dam. But the nail in the coffin was the end quote. Hit list end quote. Found in Patricia's safe. A binder labeled obstructions containing names of homeowners, including me, with notes like end quote, pressure, end quote, bankrupt, end quote, and end quote, remove, end quote. When I took the stand, I didn't end Oppos. T look at the lawyers. I looked at the jury. End quote. This wasn't end Oppos. T about a fence, end quote. I told them, my voice steady. End quote. This was about a group of people who thought that because they had money and a title, they could rewrite the laws of nature and the laws of this country. They wanted the water, so they decided to break the man who protected it. End quote. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. The verdict was a hammer blow. Guilty on all counts. Racketeering, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, felony trespassing, extortion. Kincaid got 25 years. When the judge read the sentence, the big tough commando put his head on the table and wept. Patricia Vane, the queen of Pineview Heights, got 19 years and was ordered to pay full restitution. The Pineview Heights HOA board was dissolved by the state effective immediately. As the bailiffs led them away, the sound of the chains rattling on Patricia's ankles was the sweetest music I'd ever heard. 6 months later, the valley has healed. The scars on the land where their ATVs tore up the grass have been covered by wildflowers. The silence in the woods is peaceful again, just the wind and the creek. I hosted a barbecue last weekend. Arthur was there, looking healthy, breathing easy now that he wasn't in Oppos. T carrying the weight of a criminal conspiracy. Sheriff Brody stopped by, out of uniform, laughing and eating ribs. We raised a glass as the sun went down over Thorn's Run. End quote. To boundaries, end quote. I said, looking out over the vineyard where the water was still running cold and clear. End quote. And to defending them. End quote. But as I sit here now, telling you this story, looking at the piece I had to fight a war to keep, I have to ask you a question. We like to think that owning a piece of land, having a deed with your name on it, makes you safe. We think the law is a shield that automatically protects us. But if I hadn't Oppos, T been awake? If I hadn't Oppos, T known how to wire those lights? If Arthur hadn't Oppos, T found his conscience at the last second? It makes you wonder, doesn't Oppos, T it? In a world where corporate entities and power-hungry associations can buy and quote, security and quote, teams and forge government documents, do we really own our land? Or are we just holding on to it until someone ruthless enough decides to take it? Because in the end, the only line that mattered wasn't Oppos, T the one on the survey map. It was the line I drew in the dirt, and the will I had to stand behind it. Stay safe out there, and watch your perimeter.